Our first keynote speaker, life's mission is the eradication of poverty and the ultimate goal of societal self-sufficiency, which continues to be a fueling force in all that he does, thus merging his personal and professional life into one. We welcome ABC's own President and CEO, Jerome Underwood.
Thank you, Mubarak. Good morning again, everyone. Today and this morning, we're going to address the issue of closing the racial wealth gap. A very, very important topic for so many. And as Mubarak mentioned, and Dan Burns mentioned in his remarks, going beyond talking about an issue is really, really important. And we want to encourage, we being Action for a Better Community, encourage our partners to continue to work collaboratively on this very, very, very thorny issue, which has plagued this country for a very, very, very long time. As many of you know, Action for a Better Community is part of a national network of community action agencies called the National Community Action Partnership. We're one of 1,000 agencies across the country that do very, very similar work. We have a mantra that we refer to as the promise of community action. And it shows up in the slideshow that you're watching as we show who our sponsors are. But I want to take a minute to just recite the promise of community action because it really helps to ground us in our work and literally gives purpose to the work we do. And it goes as follows. Community action changes people's lives. It embodies the spirit of hope. It improves communities and it makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Yes, we are. We say that to open our staff meetings. We open our board meetings with that, again, to ground us in our why. I've created a presentation this morning, and as I bring it up, share my screen. I was inspired by, this past weekend was MLK weekend. And I've been inspired, like so many of us have been inspired by Dr. King. And I was reading one of his speeches, he did in 1968, actually. And it's about the will. We have the will. And this is actually a quote from that speech that Dr. King gave. Again, this was March 1968. I'll read it. This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The question is whether America will do it. There is nothing new about poverty, he said. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will. We're going to talk about that will this morning. This keynote, and certainly the panel that's going to follow, is about our will to do what we know should happen. But not everyone is convinced that it should happen. But I think most people, when faced with the question of, is there a hierarchy of human being? I think most people would say no. Is there a hierarchy of human being? And 2 nights ago, our community foundation, along with 3 other foundations across the street, hosted Heather McGee. It was an amazing talk she gave us. She always does. And she's famous for her book, some of us. And in that book, and she spoke about it 2 nights ago as well, as a solidarity dividend that we in this country could realize if indeed we had the will to get nice things, as she called it. Nice things like what? Equity. So before I take you into that, we're going to talk a little bit about symbolic imagery. I want to just set things up a little bit. I'm a student of African history and spirituality, and some of you may be familiar with Adinkra symbols. This Adinkra symbol, you may have seen it around, but its significance to me for this particular talk is very important. It's pronounced Sesa Wo Saban, Sesa Wo Saban, and it means to change or transform your character. To change or transform your character. I submit to all of us, me included, that in order for us to have the collective will to close the racial wealth gap, we have to do some internal character work. You see, the injustice has been there for so long, and as Dr. King said, we know what to do. The question is, do we have the will? What's preventing us from really pushing forward to realize justice and equity for everyone? So Sesa Wo Saban is something I want you to keep in mind just as we go along. Imagery. Here's a scenario. We know in professional sports in this country that they're draft picks. And typically, the team that gets the draft pick or the first round draft picks are the weakest team. And why do we do that? Basketball, football, pick a sport. The reason that is done is to create parity in these leagues, to create equity, if you will, because some teams need more than others in order for the entire league to get better. Keep that imagery in your mind as we go along. Second symbolism, and I've used this several times. Some of you may have heard it already, but I think it's effective. If I came by anyone's house, office, and just took your phone, just took it, and maybe a month later, I'd come by and said, let's say it was Mary. Mary, I'm sorry I took your phone. Are we okay? Has Mary been made whole? No. At a minimum, I should give Mary her phone back. Depending on how much time had passed, I may have to upgrade the phone. At a minimum, I need to give her phone back. Mary was out of sorts while she didn't have a phone. She didn't know where she was supposed to go, what time of meetings was. She couldn't check her bank balance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if I took her phone, in order to restore her to where she was, at a minimum, I will have to give her phone back. And again, stick those two scenarios in the back of your mind as we continue. Who gets the draft picks? And how do we give the phone back? For us at ABC, we were born out of the birth canal of injustice. Advocacy and social justice is really in our DNA. We know that poverty is upheld by laws, policies, practices in all aspects of private and public life. We know also that despite the wonderful programs that not only ABC, but our colleagues, be that the Urban League, Jordan Health, Ibero, the YW, we know that none of us can program our way out of poverty. But the programs we provide are essential for people. There is need right now. We also are very, very much aware that what we experienced in the past 3 years with COVID-19 has reinforced the fact that racism is indeed a public health crisis. COVID has pushed us ABC back to our advocacy roots. Some of you will remember that our first virtual conference was titled Racism is a Public Health Crisis, Attacking the Two Pandemics. So many of you supported that, and that work continues. Brian Stevenson, this is his quote: "The opposite of poverty isn't wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice." How can we get a justice for everyone? Do we have the will? Equity is the foundation of justice. Equity is indeed a superpower waiting to be used. The Brookings Institute and others have talked about equity being the new innovation that is going to help this country economically. Equity is the foundation of justice. We firmly believe that. But how do you operationalize that? So in order to do that, our entire network, along with so many others in this country, has declared racism as a public health crisis. We at ABC, we're really proud that we indeed had some influence in that. And our network produced an entire resource guide for our 1,000 plus agencies to utilize that to help operationalize counteracting the reality that racism is a public health crisis. And indeed, inside this booklet, there's a small but powerful quote that all people are entitled to human dignity and access to health and well-being. All people are entitled to human dignity and access to health and well-being. As some of us would say, adequate access to the social determinants of health. We're very sober about the fact that systemic discrimination created and maintains the racial wealth gap. Systemic discrimination created and maintains the racial wealth gap. In an article written in December of 2020, this is from Brookings, written by Vanessa Williamson. I'll quote: "Centuries of discrimination and exploitation have left Black Americans much poorer than white Americans." No surprise there. The median white household has a net worth 10 times that of the median Black household. If Black households held a share of the national wealth in proportion to their share of the US population, it would amount to 12.68 trillion in household wealth, rather than the actual 2.54 trillion. In other words, the total racial wealth gap is therefore $10.14 trillion. Now think for a minute, what could this country do with additional $10.14 trillion? Discrimination keeps us from doing that. I'd be intellectually dishonest if we didn't look at some data. Look at some data and how did we get here? This is a slide that some of you may have seen it before, as it comes from Common Ground Health's Color of Health. And full disclosure, I'm a Common Ground Health board member. So shout out to our CEO, Wade Norwood. He'd be mad at me if I didn't mention that. And what this data point says, and this is for all of America, only 25% of Black Americans are able to rise from poor households to the middle class. Only 25%, as opposed to 46% of our Caucasian brothers and sisters. A little more than half, but only 25%. So I call that economic immobility. Further, as it's been said so many times, well, if you all just work a little harder and get educated, things would equalize. The data point here from the same publication, This is Monroe County data illustrating the racial wealth gap. And the way you want to read this, on the far left, even individuals who are Black with a bachelor's degree or higher make 87 cents on the dollar to our white counterparts. 87 cents on the dollar with the same education. And the same is true all throughout every socioeconomic category, from bachelor's all the way to less than high school. Economic insecurity, again, Monroe County data. Now, this is taken from the US Census, median household income. The two red arrows highlight Monroe County data for, again, our white counterparts and people of African descent. And in Monroe County, the median household income for whites is more than twice that of African Americans, more than twice. The data for our Latino brothers and sisters is not much different either. So this gives rise again to, this is some evidence of what the racial wealth gap is doing, the impact it has on people and families. One more. This is home ownership. Of course, the more you earn, the higher likelihood you have of home ownership. So when we look at same data, again, from Monroe County, home ownership rates for whites, 71%, and for people of African descent, 32%. It's an astounding racial wealth gap. What can we, what should we do? What should we do? And this is where last year at this conference, we introduced to the Rochester Lexicon and beyond, greenlining. We know that redlining happened. We're not here to talk about the fact that redlining happened. What do we do to counteract that? And as Dr. King said, we know what to do. Question is, do we have the will to do it? These types of gaps, if you will, and specifically referring to the racial wealth gap, these types of gaps are not tolerated in other segments of American life. No. Because see, we know what to do. But do we do it? To give an example, in terms of not tolerating gaps, there's a professional football team about 70 miles west of us that many people in Monroe County are major fans of. There was a time when, the team was not doing too well. The gap in achievement was not tolerated. How did that happen? How did that happen? Well, there's a quarterback by the name of Josh Allen. Draft pick, first round, I think he was number 7. First round draft pick. And look what has happened. Just imagine that we applied that ideological thinking and action to this racial wealth gap. Again, we know what to do. Do we have the will? Do we have the will? Do we believe that there's no hierarchy of human beings? Do we believe in equity? How do we operationalize equity? Ask the bills. Closing the racial wealth gap will take deliberate and focused action by many, many, many. It's going to actually take, I'll say this word, collusion. We're going to have to collaborate, specifically as it relates to home ownership. There are many different types of businesses it's not just our banks, but appraisal companies, insurance companies, you name it. All of us are going to need to make a conscious decision to say, we will not any longer stand for the racial wealth gap. We have to find a way to greenline. We know how to do it. Do we have the will? Do we have the will? Just recently, the New York State Department of Financial Services did a report, got right in my hand. It's a second report on the department's inquiry into redlining. And this report that was just received last month, December 8th to be specific, covers mortgage lending from 2016 to 2021 in Syracuse, Rochester, and Long Island. So I'm going to summarize just a few of the findings, some not surprising at all. Redline neighborhoods are predominantly populated by guess who? People, Black people and immigrants. Nothing shocking there. Mortgages were largely unavailable in redline neighborhoods, leading to what? What we have right now, concentrated poverty. Mortgages were unavailable in redline neighborhoods, leading to concentrated poverty. We created this poverty situation by our actions. The report also examined 21 counties and cities that were formerly industrialized cities. And what they found out, that these are the cities with the highest racial income gaps. On the list of 21, our neighbors to the west, Erie County and Buffalo, was number 3 on that list of 21. We, Monroe County, Rochester, number 5. And our friends to the east, Syracuse, number 7. The highest racial income gaps. Further, developers of real estate wrote restrictive covenants. This is somewhat historical. They wrote restrictive covenants based on the premise that sales to whites would attract higher prices and also sustain home values. Clearly, someone thinks that there's a hierarchy of human being when you base the premise that sales to Caucasians would attract higher prices than sales to others. That shows up. The report pointed out that, again, lower number of mortgages in BIPOC, typo there, I'm sorry about that, BIPOC majority areas, right? One thing that the report uses the term minority. And I'm on a crusade to have folks stop identifying people of color as minorities, because if there's a minority, there must be a majority. Words matter. But over the period, again, there were lower number of mortgages to BIPOC people even though they were the majority in terms of population in those areas. For the Rochester MSA, which has a population of just about 24% non-whites, the percentage of lending for all lenders was only 11.32%, only half. The Rochester MSA, which is 24% non-white, of all the lenders combined, only 11.32% of the loans went to BIPOC people. Folks, we can do better than that. We must. Again, the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. We are indeed justice workers. Our entire network of community action agencies, we advocate for systemic change so that poverty doesn't continue to thrive. Our process for community change involves acquiring knowledge, sharing it with others so that there is shared understanding, which will ultimately lead us to take action. This conference, empowerment, equity, and accountability, is how we do that. This is one way in which we do that, because we're looking to take collective action to close the racial wealth gap and enable families to thrive, which will essentially make it better for everyone. We want to take action to make a better community. But the question for all of us, is, do we have the will? That's my question to all of us this morning as I look to close. Do we have the will? Another quote, Abraham Kendi this time. Individual behaviors can shape the success of individuals, but policies determine the success of groups. We know that the Federal Home Loan Bank created policy that allowed for the GI Bill. We know that redlining was actually the law at one point in time, and it created practice where it just became natural. So if we did that, we can certainly undo it, and we can focus on those marginalized areas, which we know needs the top draft pick. Things were taken from people of African descent and people of color to a wider extent. People's phones were taken. We need to give it back. And we can do it through policy. Which team economically needs the #1 draft pick or the top draft picks? That should guide policy. But the question for all of us folks is, do we have the will to do so? What would prevent us? What has prevented us from doing that? I leave you to ponder that. And there endeth my reading. The panel that's going to follow me is going to dig deeper into that. And I hope that question stays with everyone. Do we have the will to have equity and justice for everyone as a means to closing the racial wealth gap? Thank you very much. See you soon.